My name is Dr. Jonathan Grant. I'm an assistant professor of sociology and Africana studies at the University of North Florida, and I have the pleasure of welcoming a longtime friend, colleague, Dr. Jayme Canty, professor at Clark Atlanta University and Kennesaw State University. We go all the way back to Clark Atlanta as students,
Yep.
getting our master's degrees. Writing our thesis, trying not to be stressed, and now
Right.
we are professors stressing out the next generation of students.
And also still stressed out. Like the stress
And
out
right,
part is
and
still
still
there. We're still stressed. It just is a different type of stress.
just a different type of stress, but we are balancing and we are making it. So
Yes.
greetings to you, Dr. Canty, and thank you so much for speaking with my class today.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I'm so honored.
Yes, yes. Although this is a Zoom interview and it's not live, I am excited to talk to you and have my students understand more about your research, the courses that you teach, your career as an academician, a scholar, a teacher, and everything that you've been doing. And of course, this conversation is really going to be centered around your book, Snapping Beans: Voices of a Black Queer Lesbian South.
Yeah.
So that's kind of where we're going to be focusing on today.
Okay.
And as a fellow Southerner, and dare I say a proud Southerner,
A
we both
proud.
a proud, and that's why I wanted to put that in there, a proud Southerner.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
We both know what it's like to have this love-hate relationship with the South
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
because we were both born and raised in the South, and being Black in the South, we have had to navigate so many different time periods, decades of being Black in the South. We've had to
Mm-hmm.
navigate what it means to go through various aspects of our country's modern history, whether you talk
Mm-hmm.
about the O.J. Simpson case, whether you talk about the Watts
Sure.
riot, or not the Watts riots, the LA riots, whether you
Yeah.
talk about 9/11 or the Gen 6, or everything that we've had to do as in coming of age in the South, right?
Mm-hmm.
But not only that, as people who are Black people, but also we love Black people and
Right.
want to see Black people do well, and
Yeah.
look at that as the launching pad for seeing our whole communities and our societies to do well
Mm-hmm.
as citizens of this country.
Yeah.
It's important for us to have these kind of conversations, right?
It is. It
But
is.
with you, you have this unique perspective because
Mm-hmm.
you being a woman, a queer woman in the South, there are a plethora of other experiences about the South that I have no connection to. And so
Right.
that's why I think you as a scholar, you as a theoretician, and this book as such an important book in academic dialogue.
Thank you.
Think this is so important to put out into the internet space and,
Thank you.
and to
Yay.
share with this next generation. So basically, my first set of questions are for my students, some of which who have read, some of which who have never read your book, and others who've read some parts of your book that I'll have available for them. What is this book about, and why did you feel it was necessary to write a book on the Black queer lesbian voice in the South?
Mm. Well, I'll start with the first one first.
Mhm.
So, really, I wanted a book that reflected me as I was going through my graduate studies, as we both did at Clark Atlanta University, both centered in works about Africana persons, African American persons, Black folk, however we want to call it, right?
Mhm.
That I wanted to see my experiences highlighted within the canon. And I wanted to see, what did Black queerness look like? How do Black folks theorize and articulate this thing called queerness? Because everything that I saw related to feminism and queerness came from a predominantly white space. But then I was like, I didn't grow up in that. So I grew up as a Southern Black woman. So where is my voice in this? And then whenever you only make queerness and LGBTQIA a white thing, it erases the consciousness of Black folks Black queer folk who have a consciousness about their gender and their queerness and their sexuality and their embodiment. So
Right.
even though we've always existed in the South, we've always existed in this way, there hasn't been a voice out there. So I felt like I wanted to see those voices amplified.
Mm,
And when I started this work, I started what I call what Barbara Smith, was it Barbara Smith? No, Anita Cromwell.
mm,
Anita Cromwell, who's a Black feminist scholar, she called it the breadcrumbs, you know,
mm,
where I was getting breadcrumbs from Black feminist scholarship because that was where it started. It started in Black feminist scholarship because that was where my love was. And then it blossomed, and then it blossomed into this discussion about queerness, but it was still breadcrumbs. I was just getting a little bit here, a little bit there, but
mm,
nothing that was like a full text. And then E. Patrick Johnson came out with Sweet Tea, and I was like, oh, great. But it talked
mm.
about Black gay men.
Right.
And so it was like, okay, well, we're starting this conversation. But it was so funny because as I was writing the book, E. Patrick Johnson came out with Southern Black queer women.
Mm,
Um, an oral history of Black queer women living in and from the South. And I was like, oh, great, he did it. So I don't have to do it.
mm.
But then there was still a part of me that was like, I still need to see more. I can't just
Yeah.
rely on one person to do it. I guess I still have to do the work a little bit more. And I think from the vantage point of a Black queer person
Mm,
existing and living in the South, there's a level, another layer to the story that I think I can add.
mm,
So that's why I wanted. So what the book is about, it's chronicling a journey to self-actualization of Southern Black queer women and gender nonconforming persons living in or from the American South. And what I
mm,
wanted to do, and I interviewed 39 women and persons who, again, living in or from the American South, who were sharing with me how specifically the Southern Christian Black Church shaped and mold their coming out narratives,
mm.
and how it shaped and mold their queer actualization. So when I'm talking about queer actualization, I mean like essentially the coming out story, what it
Right.
meant for them to be queer, existing and living in the South and attending church. And even if you don't attend church, being surrounded by what the South means in terms of the church. So that's essentially what it's chronicling. So what I chronicle is different phases that this little Southern Christian Black girl is dealing with,
Mm,
living in and from the South. So I chronicle who I call the silent Black queer girl. I chronicle
mm,
her narrative because that's where it starts.
mm.
So I start with the silent South and the vantage point of the South. Um,
Yeah.
so I start with the silent South, then I go to the shameful and condemning South, where I talk about the not only the external shame that the church places on Black queer bodies, but also the internal shame, which is the condemnation that Black queer folks experience. And that's when
Mm,
we it's the famous closet
mm,
euphemism.
mm, mm,
But instead of me calling it a closet, it's a toxic closet because you're
mm,
existing in two worlds at the same time. So I document that and that whole notion of internal homophobia.
mm,
And so then from there, the silent Black queer girl is dealing with judgment, which we talk a lot about heterosexism and heteropatriarchy and Black heteropatriarchy,
mm,
and how very different from Black queer men or Black queer boys, there is this shame, there's this judgment for Black women existing as queer or gender fluid.
mm,
And I create what I call the Southern Black personality. And he is like he or she, because I definitely make it clear that the Southern Black personality is not a he
right,
primarily,
right.
that there are women who also perpetuate this, but this notion that there's this patriarchy that exists within the Black community, um, and not only the patriarchy, but also the heterosexism that
Mhm,
together creating this kind of gender hegemony that exists in the South.
mhm,
And if you don't exist in this hegemony, then you are judged. So it's dealing with that. And then ultimately, dealing with the authentic and reconciled South, where what does it mean to be liberated? What does it mean to be free from
mm,
all of these things, from the shame, from the silence and the shame and the
mm,
condemnation and the judgment? What does it mean to be free from all that in the context of the South?
Yeah.
What does it mean to reconcile with all of those things? And then also, what does coming out really mean for Black queer folk, Southern Black queer
Mhm.
folk? Because I think people have a very white lens into the coming out narrative,
Right.
and not looking at how coming out looks for Black queer folks living in or from the American South. And
Mm.
so instead of it being like, let's come out, let's sing Diana Ross coming out, it's
Mhm.
this weight lifted off, or it's this level of authenticity. And so when I go into there, a lot of that chapter goes into love, self-love,
Mhm.
communal love, and love for the South. And so
Mm.
in reconciling with all that love, there's also a reconciling with the church and what that means. So it goes through that journey in that chapter. And then finally, it creates what I call the Black Queer Lesbian South. Now, the Black Queer Lesbian South has always existed, but I wanted to uncover what it means and what it looks like for Southern Black queer folks to not only exist but thrive.
Mhm.
So that chapter outlines the ways in which Black folks, Southern Black folks, have traditionally found ways to thrive in the South, and so the same thing happens with Black queer folk, we find ways to thrive within the South. So that's what that book chronicles. Long story short, but
Mhm.
essentially, in a nutshell, it's covering the hurting and healing that Black queer folk, Southern Black queer women, and gender nonconforming persons experience. That we're not only dealing with the whole, I guess, not lesbian trauma, right? The
Mhm.
trauma of what it means to be a lesbian or be a queer person, but also dealing with how do we find wholeness and how do we find,
Mhm.
ways to thrive and ways to be um, our full selves,
Mhm.
authentically our full selves, and
Mhm.
to love our full selves. That we're not just this tragic lesbian story, that there is the other side of it that's full of love and affirmation and reconciliation. So
Mhm.
that's essentially what it chronicles, that journey.
Ooh, this is so good. I'm so excited. I'm so excited. I mean, and so much that you said. Well, one place I really want to start with, because we're going to go into the race part, we're going to go into the gender part and all of that as well. But
Mhm.
what I really love is this. I want to stay in the South for a second. And as a person from the South, um, even as a male from the South, right, we understand the importance of food, right? And how
Mhm.
food brings us together. And I
Absolutely.
remember as a young boy, a teenage boy, I remember my mama, I'm watching TV in the living room, and my mama say, look here, until you get a wife that's gonna cook for
Amen.
you ain't gonna starve. So get in here in this kitchen and
Period.
and I'm gonna teach you how to make some dishes, okay?
Yes.
And so,
Amen.
as a Southern person that knows his way around the kitchen, there are Black Southern traditions that come from the Black Southern family kitchen, right?
Absolutely.
But what I thought was really interesting is this idea of snapping beans. So,
Mhm.
out of all of those Southern traditions, why did you choose snapping beans as the metaphor for this discussion?
Because when you think about snapping beans with grandma and them, as you mentioned, grandma and them, and
Mhm.
literally use that terminology in the book, grandma and them,
Grandma knew. Yeah.
um, phonetically making it grandma and them.
Right, right, right.
Um,
AAVI.
right. EM. But
Right.
when you're thinking about snapping beans is one of those Southern dishes. First of all, snapping beans is not just a green beans are not just a Southern thing. It's something
Mhm.
that's, obviously everybody does. But
Mhm.
there's a way in which snapping beans invokes a Southern feminine history. So when you're snapping beans or grandma and them, it
Mhm.
what you're doing is creating that female communal space.
Mhm.
And it's a memory that's etched in you that when you snap beans, even as adults, you are reminded of snapping beans with grandma and them. And
Mhm.
so I use snapping beans as a metaphor to talk about, not only remind the community that I'm interviewing and talking to about the South,
Mhm.
it kind of transports them to a southern space, right?
Oh, okay.
Where like regardless of where they're at, they remember or have memories of snapping beans. And even if they don't have memories of snapping beans, they see snapping beans as an innately southern black female thing
Mhm.
to do. You know,
Mhm. Mhm.
um, I based on conversations I had, I didn't hear many men in the room. snapping beans, right? That's
Mhm.
very much a feminine communal thing to do. Even when
Right.
I did it with my own grandmother, it was definitely something I did with my grandmother, even though my dad was like you, very much well versed in the kitchen, very much,
Mhm.
you know, my grandmother told my dad that very much like your grandma told you, until you get married, you need to learn how to cook. You better get in this kitchen and learn how to cook.
Mhm.
But
Mhm.
also, my brother had 5 sisters, and my
Mhm.
dad would be out in the streets, and my grandma would be like, "All right, you wanna be out in the street, you're gonna miss out on food." So he had to learn to cook. He had to learn
Right.
because he otherwise he would starve,
Right.
right?
Right.
So, but when I'm thinking about snapping beans, my dad didn't really do that with us. It was mainly me, my aunts, my grandma, right?
Mhm.
Very feminine space. So I wanted to invoke that for my interlockers. That's who I call them. I don't call them participants. I call them
Mhm.
interlockers, because these are women and persons with whom I was in conversation with, right?
Mhm. Mhm.
So as I'm talking to these women and persons, there there are memories that are deeply feminine, and not only that, there are memories and lessons of authenticity that translate into our queerness. So
Mhm.
the levels that grandma was telling us when we were snapping beans with grandma and them, um, it wasn't just for the purpose of course, creating dinner because you need to make dinner, right?
Mhm. Right. We gotta
Also,
eat.
gotta eat, right?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
also the process of canning that. Now, the canning process was really very unique for me. I was just like, oh, I didn't think about that. But that's so Southern. You
Mhm.
know, how we can and store things because Southern folks believe in cooking things during certain seasons, right?
Mhm.
So if you are canning the green beans during a certain time, it may be off season, but then you can them for future use, you know.
Mhm. Mhm. Mhm.
And you might put with like, you know, a meat of sort, and the meat is more of a preservative. So
Preserve, yeah.
Southern Black folks have been doing the whole preserving things for a very
Long time. Yeah, yeah, yeah,
that's part of our heritage and culture as Southern Black folk. You know, we know
right,
how to
right.
do that because our access was limited in those
Mhm.
kind of ways, right? And we also, like I said, we also believe in eating things during the season, very much connected to our African selves.
Mhm. Mhm.
Um, but the but when they're canning, when they're snapping, when they're canning, when they're cooking, it's a process. So it's a very long process. And during that is a really an oral history tradition is taking place.
Mhm.
You're sharing knowledge, you're sharing information. It might be gossip. Most of the time when I was sitting with grandma and them, it was gossip. It was talking about what was going on, who did what to whom. This is what
Right,
happened the other day. This is what I heard.
right.
But the other part of that is, while it was gossip, another was we saw the way our grandma and them saw the world. So it
Mm.
was a way to see the way they saw the world. And not only the way they saw the world, what they questioned about the world.
Mhm.
Very queer in nature.
Mhm.
Because
Mhm.
when you're questioning the world, you're asking questions, you are challenging traditional norms, you
Mhm.
are all of these things. That's what we saw grandma doing in the kitchen. So
Mhm.
what I use snapping beans is really that was our pathway to our Southern Black queerness because
Mhm.
grandma and them were in their being authentic. They were questioning the world. It was out the watchful eyes of man, so they were able to speak freely, and it was in spaces that were communal, like I mentioned, among other, you know, Black female family members.
Mhm.
And it was during that time that we were not outsiders because of our queerness. We were part of a community feeding our families, right? We were participating in that, but in that process, we were also learning the ways grandma saw the world. And we are also leaning into grandma was being authentic because she didn't have to worry about grandpa or the uncles or anybody hearing them. They could be themselves. There were
Right.
conversations that my grandma would have with just me that she may not have in front of my dad,
Mhm. Mhm.
because it was outside the watchful eyes of others. Even my grandmother who just passed away, it was the same way with her, is that, with communities, of course, someone wants to call me right now. Sorry. With community and with being among within the Black female community,
Mhm.
you were able to have a level of freedom and authenticity and
Mhm.
speak your mind without having to worry about what the men thought.
Right.
So I think that that was the pathway to have those Black queer conversations about authenticity, existing outside the watchful eyes of others, challenging the world around you. Because queerness, even though yes, is related to the LGBTQIA community, yes, queerness is also an opportunity for us to challenge the world, challenge
Yes.
structures. It is
Yes.
anti-normative in
Mhm.
various ways. It's ways of saying this is what's conceived as normal, but is that really normal, right? It's really um anti-normative in that way. And but the crazy thing about it is our southern cisgender heterosexual grandma was doing that.
Mm.
She might not have called it queer,
She didn't call it queer, yeah, but
right?
that's what she's doing. Yeah.
But that's what she was doing. So
Mhm.
that's why I use snapping beans specifically for that,
Mm.
mainly because of the process and what happens during that process. And like I mentioned in the book, it's also like the oral history method.
Mm.
So that a lot of the lessons I gained about what it meant to be a Black woman and what it meant to be a Southern Black woman came from my grandma and them. It didn't come from the classroom. I actually didn't learn much about Southern Black womanhood within the classroom.
Mm.
A lot of it came from my grandma and them, or even
Mm.
womanhood. My first lessons on feminism came from my grandma and them, right?
Mm. Mm.
Because of the experiences that they had, the stories that they would share, the ways in which they would gossip and question the world. And, they may have even mentioned a queer person, but and it wouldn't have been they're going to hell. Many times
Mm.
grandma said, well, listen, I get it because these men folk
Mm.
ain't no joke. I get it because these men folk is annoying. I feel like you saw the way that they allow people to be themselves.
Right.
And so yeah, and many times it was for the freedom to really speak your mind in those places.
Mm.
Hmm.
Mm. One of the things that I love about this text and the way in which you add texture to this conversation around race and sexuality and gender is the element of place and space, right?
Hmm.
And even in talking about snapping beams. Like there's a kind of place-centeredness even within the title, and there's a
Absolutely.
certain sanctity, right, that exists
Absolutely.
in several generations of women are snapping beans around the table. And then now
Mhm.
you have these oral histories that are going on. Now you have these multi-level conversations that are happening and these, inter and intra analyses that are happening all at the same time around music that's happening or a TV that's in the background or whatever's going on, or maybe we just hearing, the fire from the stove or whatever's happening. But there's
Absolutely.
something there's a certain sanctity to that space. And so I love how you deal with place and space in this conversation. And
Yeah.
so we're going to talk about that with these next couple of questions. And one thing that I noticed you mentioned is this notion of a sexual geography. And that
Mm.
was something that was new because in my race, place, and inequality class, we have talked about Black geographies. We have talked about spatialization, confinement, residential segregation, all of those things around Black geographies. But I had never heard of a sexual geography. And so I wanted you to break down that notion for us that may be new to this concept.
Yeah. So when I started talking, because I did think about it from a Black geography's perspective, and really
Mhm.
this conversation started because it was hard for me to define the South as a place and space. And so when I was talking to women in persons about the South, and even as I was originally conceptualizing what the South meant,
Mhm.
um, it was tricky because
Mhm.
I had to go from the US South to the American South. Because when you think about the US South, you think about like the census, like
Mhm.
certain states below the Mason-Dixon line and whoever did like the legacy of the Confederacy, how many, particularly red states and things like
Mhm.
that. It's very politicized and it's very much based on where do they fit in a capitalist society? Where do these states fit in a capitalist society? Where do they fit within the historical trajectory of America? But then I'm like, but who's America? you
Mhm.
know, because Black folks don't look at the South that way,
Mhm.
because of course Black folks being not only enslaved, but then segregated, and then the Jim Crow, and then, with the neo slavery,
Mhm.
convict leasing system. So we have a very different understanding of what the South is and what it means.
And I mean, you go to Chicago, you got some of the most Southern people in the world live
That
right
part,
up there in Chicago,
Chicago. And
St. Louis, and I mean, you like, man, these folks sound more Southern than my cousins in Georgia.
listen, because and literally because there was a line that went from Mississippi to Chicago. So I
Mhm.
with people who are from Chicago. I said, "Oh, you're really from Mississippi."
Right,
Guaranteed, 7 out of the 10 times I'm right.
right. And it ain't that far back. You might have been born in Cook County, but
Correct.
somebody else was born somewhere in Holly Springs, Mississippi. So,
Guaranteed, if you go down 2 generations, somebody came
right.
from Mississippi.
Somebody came from there, or Memphis,
Mississippi or
somewhere.
Louisiana, okay?
That's it.
Straight
Yeah,
shot to Chicago.
yeah,
You
yeah.
know, this great migration. But like, and that's the other thing about Southernness is like because Black folks migrated to so many different places, um, does that mean that their southernness goes away?
Mhm.
So this whole notion of defining what the South is and what it means became really like nuanced for me in a way that I really had to dig a lot into, Southern studies and geography studies, and things of that sort, because I had to make sense of, okay, when I'm talking about the US South, what do I mean? Because I had so many people asking me questions about how am I defining the South? And so then I had to go from the US South to the American South because when, again, for marginalized communities, the ways in which we view the South is based on our version of America.
Mhm.
And that even though the South is definitely seen as red and racist and all that thing, that this whole notion of racism is an American issue, not just a Southern issue.
Mhm.
Southern folks are just
Mhm.
more vocal about it,
Mhm.
right?
Mhm.
Southern folks are more absurd about it. It's more in
Mhm.
your face in a way because of the legacy of the Confederacy, in the
Mhm.
way that if you go to Boston, you're still going to deal with racism. It just might look different,
Mhm.
or like you mentioned, Chicago. You might go to Chicago. There's still racism in Chicago. It might just look differently, right?
Mhm.
So
Right.
then it was this whole, okay, if Black folks in the South, okay, well, of course, going into geography studies, going into place and space, going into the fact that yeah, I'm talking about the location of the South, but there's a space of the South, kind of like Imani Perry was talking about the South to America, where America is the South because of this migration. So is it a space, really, this
Mhm.
metaphorical kind of space where, regardless, you carry the South with you?
And
So
Malcolm X said everywhere below Canada is the South because
ev- ev-
because of the way our country is racialized. So he like
exactly.
all of this is the
This
South.
is the South. There is nothing that's not the South.
Right,
What I mean?
right,
Whatever
right.
capacity. So it's so interesting that because Black folks migrated, Black folks moved, and they took their families with them. But did they take their traditions with them? Right?
Mhm.
They also took when I have a friend who's from Colorado, but her mom is from South Carolina. And when I was talking to her about this, she was like, it made me think about my grandma. That even though she left South Carolina because it was so racist, it was just terribly racist. And she moved out to Colorado. She was like, first of all, she realized Colorado isn't more racist than South Carolina, it just looks different. And secondly, that there's a lot of southernness and southern sensibilities that she took with her, that she brought with her,
Mhm.
you know. So it's this level of um excuse me, it's this level of this movement of southernness that I had to grapple with. It
Mhm.
was like southernness is not just located within that whole US southern thing, right? So then I started to think about McKittrick's, and I'm trying to look for the book on my Demonic Grounds by McKittrick.
Yes, minor grounds. Yeah. Mhm.
Yes, where she talks about this racialized geography, where Black folks are claiming place in space. Then she talks about the racialized sexual geographies, where Black
Mhm.
women are claiming place in space. So, what does it mean for Black women to claim the South? What histories do Black women have within the South? How is that amplified? How does that help us understand the South better? Or
Right.
not even just the South. How does it help us understand the geographies better? Because McKittrick was talking specifically about Canadian women, you know,
Mhm.
but it helps us to understand how. What I loved about her piece is that it helped us to see how place and space can help us how people existing in a certain place and space inform that place and space. Like
Right.
you can't talk about the South without talking about Black folks. You can't talk about, you know, these places and spaces without talking about the women in those places and spaces, right? Um, and so what it got me thinking was about this racialized sexual queer geography, where how does the American South, how do Black queer folks, how are they informed by the South? And how are they informed by the South, and how does the South inform their identities? So this
Mm,
kind of reciprocal relationship that happens not only with Black queer folks in the South, particularly Black queer women and gender nonconforming persons in the South. How does the South shape and mold who they are in their
mm,
sexualities, in the intersections of their race, gender, and class and sexualities? How does it inform that? But also, how does the South inform? How does their vantage point of the South help us to understand the South better? Right?
mm,
So how that's why the book is placed the silent South, the shameful and condemning South, the judgmental South, because I wanted in this racialized sexual queer geography, I wanted us to share how we see the South based
mm,
on these intersections. So when I was kind of creating this racialized sexual queer geography, that was the vantage point that I was coming from for that.
mm. I
Yeah.
love that. Oh
Yeah.
man, listen, that and it's again talking about how you problematize
Mm.
place. And not
Yeah.
only now, because now I have other questions, but I don't, we can talk for 2.5, three
Yeah.
hours. We've done it before.
We don't want to keep your
Because
students too much longer.
right.
They probably shut up. They
Because
like,
now I'm thinking about movement, I'm thinking about migration, I'm thinking about Zora Neale Hurston, like all kinds of things are just going on in my head.
mm,
And so the way in which you not only now problematize place and space
mhm,
in in its current dialogue, but also movement, right? But I'm gonna just deal with place for right now
mhm,
because there's also another place that you highlight in this text, which I remember you telling me before wasn't something that you went into, but
mhm,
it's something that actually came out of your interlockers, correct?
mhm, interlockers. Mhm,
Mhm. And that is the church as an institutional
mhm,
and cultural space, right? And so I want you to talk a little bit about that and in your research, how does the Black church play a role in the Black queer lesbian South as a collective, as well as on, maybe just a few examples of the individual levels that the church played in the voices, the experiences, and the making and remaking of this Black queer lesbian South that you speak of.
Ooh. So when I started this project, just let me go back. When I started this project, I originally was going to talk about the church. I was going to talk about economic, and I was going to talk about political because that's me.
Mm,
Social, economic, political. And so I was like, I'm going to talk about all three. But as I was interviewing these interlockers, um, the church became so foundational to their coming out narratives that it took up the whole interview. And literally
mm,
2, 3 hours just about the church.
just about the church.
Just about the church. Talked about the Southern thing. And okay, well, the interview might have been 3 hours, but the church might have been about an hour and a half. We're talking about that.
Mhm,
So before I even could go into the economics, before I even could go into the political, the church became so foundational. And I remember by maybe my fourth interview or fourth conversation, I should say. Through my fourth conversation, I joked with my interlocutor and said, I might as well just do this whole book about the church because
mhm,
it's so deep. And one of my interlocutors, Cassie, shout out to Cassie, she was great. Well, that's her. Um, she said, that's the meat and potatoes of our coming out. So it
Wow.
made me think I need to just focus on the meat and potatoes. So
Mhm,
that's when I sent the book proposal to the publisher, it was all three. But by the time I sent the whole manuscript to them, I said, so things have changed.
right.
And I'm just focusing on the church for this
Mm,
reason. And part of the reason that I gave them of why I was focusing on the church is because you can't talk about Southern folk, Southern
mhm,
Black folk, without
amen.
talking about the church.
That's it right there. I don't care what background you come from. You can be atheist, you can be whatever. The church is somewhere up in there.
Somewhere in your history.
Whatever you individually believe in, the church has influenced you in some way if you're from the South.
If you're some way from the South, because what I found is that the church, secular and social, the secular institutions are connected to the church.
Absolutely.
So, like when you think about and I think mainly about like when you're driving down the highway and you see the billboards, what billboards do you see? Or when you're
Mhm.
driving through certain cities, you're going to see a church before you see anything else, right? That the church is so connected to our secular lives in a way that you can't escape it. Like you
Mhm.
said, no matter what your religious beliefs are into your adulthood, you grew up in somebody's church, whether it's
Mhm.
a Baptist church, Pentecostal, Kojak, but and this is all before they had non-denominational. Okay. I grew up
Right.
AME. you know.
Mhm.
So even in the South, well, in the South, it's so intimately connected in terms of social world, right? It's a secular and social institution. It's a secular institution as much as it is a spiritual institution. Just as Black folk, like the history of the church, it's very intimately connected to the secular life, our secular Black lives. Like as
Mhm.
C. Eric Lincoln said, is the womb of the Black community. Like our music came from the church, our families came from the church, our political ideologies came from the church. All of these things came from the church because the church literally birthed the Black community, Black culture. You can't have Black culture without the Black church. Like it's
Mm.
connected. You could be at the club somewhere and you hear melodies from heaven, you know the song,
You're right.
and you know your part.
And you know your part. You know the alto, soprano, the tenor, rain down on me, the whole thing.
You know when your part comes in, and you know when to come in, right? Because it's
Right.
so intimately connected to who
Right.
we are as Black people.
Mhm.
Many of our artists, our musical artists, came from the church. So it's so intimately connected to Black culture that it's inescapable. And
Mhm.
so for me, I could not, I said, I have to talk about it. I
Mhm.
have to center it in this book, which is why the cover it is essentially a church.
Mhm.
Um, because who we are individually as Black queer folks come from where we are or how we were treated by the church. And
Mhm.
so it's also a very intimate institution for Black queer folk because that is the first place where mama and them told us that we were an abomination. So
Mhm.
not so many times when I was thinking about the church, I was thinking about that infamous sermons of like your homosexuality is an abomination, Leviticus, and all of those things. But
Mhm.
really, it didn't come from the pastor as much as it came from your grandmother, your mom, the same people
Mhm.
you were snapping beans with are the same people yielding this homophobic message to you or
Mhm.
saying these very homophobic things to you.
Mhm.
And often so the mother, the mother piece is really so deep in this piece, in this work. The notion of the Black mother comes up in so many different ways because the Black mother helps Black women, Southern Black women, understand who they are as Black women and Southern Black women, but also the same people that chastise Southern Black women for not conforming to Black patriarchy, right? So,
Mhm.
and I mean, there's a double-edged sword with that, right? Because the Black mother was trying to protect you, but also shaming you at the same time.
Mhm.
So I had to talk about the church because often the mothers were the practitioners of the church. So the
Mhm.
mothers acted on behalf of the church, thinking that they were saving the souls of their daughters.
Mhm.
And if I just tell her that she's gonna go to hell if she doesn't conform, if I tell her this, then maybe I will save my daughter. But really, you are shaming and ultimately condemning your daughter.
Mhm.
And so that came up a lot, and I think that that's a lot to unpack because
Right.
your mother is the person who gave birth to you. That's your mother. She gave birth to you, but then she's also the person that's hindering your self-actualization.
Mhm.
She's the one person that's stopping you from reaching your full authenticity and your full potential. So, um, that's very much connected to the church, right? And the shame from the church. And so a few accounts from mother and them, from moms specifically. Um, I had a mother who, when many of my interlockers said, when I think of the church, I think of my mama. It
Mhm.
wasn't necessarily the institution, it was mama. And so sometimes mothers would, write certain Bible verses on the mirrors of their daughters, their 16-year-old daughter. One interlocker told me when she came out to her mom at about 15, 16, she was writing Bible verses on her mirror. Another person, her mother pulled a gun out on her. Like that was a crazy part. And pulled a gun on her and was like, I will have to kill you before you shame me and to have
Mm.
a daughter, you know? And the interlocker, I was like, well, God, what did you do? And the interlocker said, I told her she would have to kill me. You know, it came to that. Then some mothers who, prime example, if you're Jehovah's Witness and you know, somehow they find out you're gay, then you are disfellowshipped from the church and therefore can't have communication with your mother. But then when you have a mother that loves you, but then is, I guess, feeling compelled, not compelled, what's the word I'm looking for, who feels bad for for talking to you because of her religious beliefs,
Mm.
right? Then you go in a back and forth with your mom where sometimes she's talking to you and sometimes she's not, and you know why, but then it's like either you're talking to me or you're not talking to me.
Mm.
So it kind of creates a lot of friction in the coming out process because your mom is so foundational to how you understand Black womanhood, but also the place that
Mm.
causes you the most harm. Another thing with the church primarily is this notion of how this internal condemnation that happens. And so part of when people talk about the closet, I
Mm.
said the closet looks different for Black queer women for living in or from the South because it's not the fact of you not coming out, is that you're like existing in two worlds. I call it a duality. And I use
Mm.
Paul Laurence Dunbar's poem, you know, the mask. We wear the mask because many times that's what happens in the condemnation, that shame that was externally given to you, external shame, is now internalized. Shame, where you start to internalize that shame, you start to see yourself as a problem. You start to be like this notion of, let me pray the gay away. There's something wrong with me. And
Mm.
so that internalized hate is what transforms into, just creates this closet. But you're not
Mm.
really in a closet. You're like one foot in, one foot out, you
Mm.
know, where you're existing in two worlds at the same time, where you're wearing a mask where, okay, I'm at church with mom and them. I'm going to, even though I wear more masculine clothing in my gay spaces, oh, I'm going to wear more feminine clothing when I go home with a mama and them. Because a
Mm.
lot of them would say, a lot of my masculine embodied lesbian interlockers would say, like, I had to conform. I knew how to act when I went home. I knew how to play the part when I went home. Even though I'm definitely more masculine embodied, but I'll put on the blouse and the makeup and the lipstick for my mom, you know,
Mm.
so she doesn't encounter shame. You know, I'm
Mm.
protecting her, even though I'm the one that has to wear the mask, you
Right.
know, of heteronormativity. Or heterosexuality. And so I think that's the biggest part that I had to unpack because without really outlining how we got there, we don't understand how important and how significant the Black Queer Lesbian South is and how beautiful it is because you're literally dealing with the self hatred. And so when you're talking about the liberation and authenticity and reconciliation, that's the process of getting out of that duality and living in your full authentic self. So I
Mm.
had to talk about the church. I had to.
Ooh, oh my goodness. Oh
So,
man. Man, I mean, and the way in which you uncover the church, the way in which you show this love and this reverence for the church, while
mhm,
also showing the ways in which churches reinforce a lot of these things that you speak against. It makes me think about not only the church, the community, but the entire South as, and I started to think about Stephanie Mills' song Home, right?
mm, mm,
As a place that we return to, right? Because even when we
yeah,
talk about these migratory patterns
mhm,
throughout the 20th century and going into the 21st century,
mhm,
we also see that even in the book Chocolate Cities, a
mhm.
lot of people look at migration as we go from this place to that place or this place to that place. But really, it's like it's this circle that's happening.
It
And
does.
there is this return, right?
Yes.
The return of a lot of our cousins and grandmas and grandpas and all these people and
Mhm,
generations later coming back to the South for the
mhm,
weather, for the colleges, for the opportunities,
mhm.
for the cheaper housing prices, right?
No, it's not cheaper for
Home
Southerners.
ownership, right, right. Home ownership. And
Right.
so as a person who never left the South necessarily, but has returned home for my career to serve my community and people, that part of this conversation in your book means so much to me, this notion of the return, this notion of home. And so
Yes.
as we, wrap up, how does snapping beans, how does this book define and redefine home within the Southern context? And also, how does this text help us delve deeper into what home is and what home should be for
Mhm.
marginalized people?
So when I think of home, uh,
Yeah, Mama Stephanie, Mama Mills.
right, Mama Mills, and who gave us another one that's a wonderful song too.
Yeah,
But
yeah.
one of the things about home, and that's one of the things that it makes this piece so complex, is that while there is some harm with the South,
Mm,
there's also is home, is home place.
mm,
When I
mm,
ask me and my interlockers, well, why do you love the South so much? What does the South mean to you? They were like, it's home. It's all I know. And not in a way of ignorance, but in a way of you returning back to yourself.
mm,
And even though there was this marginalization of your queerness, or there was this, um, this, yeah, this marginalization related to your queerness, what we start to realize is that the South can be a queer place,
mm,
right? We start to reconcile with that because, like I mentioned in the beginning, when you're snapping beans with grandma and them, you are engaged in a queer practice. You might not call it queer, but you're engaged in a queer practice.
mm,
And so I think that we start to see the beauty, but also the harm of the South, even with the
mm,
church. Yeah, church was harmful. Mama and them was harmful. But as we reconcile with the church, we either separate from the church altogether, or we see the church as a still a place of refuge, right? And realizing that as a Black queer person, I'm not devoid of the spirituality of my grandma and them. It just
mm,
looks different for me, you
mm,
know? And even this notion of God is love. God is love looks different
mm,
in this kind of notion of within this kind of queer lens,
mm,
so you start to reconcile with the South as a multidimensional space,
mm,
and that it is a place where you can lay your head, but also a place that you have to hold it accountable, right? I
mm,
love it because it makes who I am, and it makes who we are as Black queer persons, but it's also a place where I gotta hold y'all accountable and put a mirror up to y'all. This is why
mm,
we have the vantage points of the South, right?
mm,
This is the way in which I see the South. That is not all harm, but also beautiful, right? There's a beauty of Southern Blackness. There is a uniqueness to Southern Blackness that I still want to hold on to and I still carry with me, regardless of my location or where I'm at, where I'm placed at any given time. But this return home is so significant because sometimes, if you're not even returning home physically, you're returning home to who you are and
mm,
kind of having that conversation with that silent Black queer lesbian girl, letting her know there's a place and space for you to be and exist. There are communities that you could be a part of. You don't have to be silent.
mm,
So now that's where the Black Queer Lesbian South comes in, and where there's place and space for that Southern Black queer girl to thrive, to be
mm,
their authentic selves, even as Southern Black queer folks. They no longer have to wear the mask. They can exist in the fullness of who they are in their home place. They don't have to leave their home place to find their homeness. They can find it home in the South. I actually had a conversation with a doctoral student at Georgia State the other day, actually yesterday. And I was like, they went to New York. They're from Georgia, went to
mm,
New York, and they were like, yeah, I was able to find a Black queer community. Yes, I was able to find a thriving Black queer community. But as she said, there was a part of me missing in that.
mm,
She was like, I was like, that was really interesting that you left something that was so you were connected to a community, you know? And she was like, yeah, but there was a part of me missing, even though I
mm,
was there, because she had an opportunity to go to another school in New York. But she was like, I wanted to come back home. Right.
mm,
This
mm,
return home because,
mm,
as she's like, my culture's here, my family's here. Yes, I risk losing that Black queer community, but I'm going back to my roots.
mm,
And with starting something so crazy like a doctoral program, I had to go back to my roots because a doctoral program will take you out. We both know
mm,
a
mm.
doctoral program will take you out.
Yes, sir.
So you you want to be in a place and space where you feel poured into and loved, and you're closer to your root self. And so I think that that's the epitome of what the Black Queer Lesbian South is. It's this returning back home in the fullness of who you are, but also recognizing, like, let me let you know the damage that you caused, but
Mm,
also I still love you,
mm,
right? I
mm,
still love it because it's part of who I am. I knew that I was Southern before I knew I was Black, before I knew I was queer, before I knew I
mm,
was femme. I knew I was Southern, right?
mm,
And what that meant and what that looked like. And like you said in the beginning, I'm proud of it. It may not be a pretty history, even as it relates to being a Southern Black person. It's not pretty,
mm,
right? We have a
mm,
very ugly history. But then look at what we gained from
mm,
the Black South. We gained
mm,
our families, we gained our churches, we gained our sense of political advocacy, we've
mm,
gained a sense of economic, stability. We
mm,
are close to our families. And
mm.
so it's definitely this return that is necessary, and this return that really helps us to see the fullness of who we are. That's both painful and beautiful.
And it's a trip because in visiting the continent, when I visit the continent, and I've been to various places around the United States, the
Mhm.
one place that the continent reminds me of is the South, right?
Mhm.
If,
It
if
does.
you go to if you go any country in the motherland, most countries in the motherland, most places in the motherland, it is going to be very reminiscent of what we have created in the South and what we have created in the Caribbean. That
Yeah.
look like, you know what I
Yeah.
mean? And so when we return home, oftentimes it is the physical home of being in the South, but it's probably one of the closest places that we're gonna go before
Mhm.
actually going home to where, what Marcus Garvey calls our ancestral and spiritual homeland,
Yeah.
which is the continent of Africa. And so
Yeah, because many people, even within the text, talked about one of the few people I talked to was like, this is the closest thing to our African lineage. This is the
mhm,
closest thing to our African selves. When you walk on the Southern soil,
mhm,
that's the closest thing that we have to our Black self, our
right,
African selves.
right.
One of my interlocutors said, we black down here. Like, we not just Black, right? Because this is very much, like you mentioned, reminiscent of a lot of Africanness that's here within the South.
Mhm,
And it's that ancestral memory, lineage, perhaps because many of our ancestors were brought to the United States through the South. So
mhm,
even if you went to other places, that this is the birthplace, not only of Black culture, but Africanness as well.
mhm,
And
mhm.
so even the people that I spoke to that were born and raised in other places, and at first I was like, they're not gonna have nothing to say because you weren't born and raised in the South. But oh, did they? Right? Because
Yeah.
many of them said, even though I was born in, like, one of the person I spoke to was born and raised in Ohio. And they moved to the South because they realized their family is from Alabama. Their
Mhm,
lineage is from Alabama and
mhm,
Georgia. So they wanted to get closer to that family lineage, that root, right?
mhm,
And they said, when I walk on Southern soil, I feel like I'm connected to my African self.
right.
Another interlocker from Minnesota wanted to come to the South to get closer to her Black self.
Mhm,
She was like, I wanted to reconnect to my Blackness
mhm,
in a the authentic way. So I think, the South is a diasporic place in a very fun, unique way. And I want to uncover that a little bit more. But I feel like you see it, but we don't name it as such. We just think that's Black
mhm.
America, that's Southern
Right.
Black America. But it's definitely an authentic Africanness that
Mhm.
exists within the South that, I'm not saying doesn't exist other places, but I
Yeah.
feel like that's the disconnect that we miss. When I was in Vegas, loved my department. Like I told you, absolutely loved my department. If I could take my department and bring it to the South, I would.
Mhm.
One of the things that stopped me from, like, let me plant roots here, that's the central. In the South, God, church, food,
Food. And football.
and football. And you gotta have all three in that order. Good food, football.
Football,
In
right?
that family. Okay, you could add family in there too, right?
Yeah.
And football, right? But when I was there, I could not make sweet tea. And I remember being like, I cannot. I did it in so many different ways, and I could not make sweet tea. And I said, oh, I can't live here because I can't make sweet tea.
Yeah.
I can't
Yeah.
live because they don't have the brand of they don't sell like when you come to the South, you have collard greens in the store that you literally can get a bushel of collard greens. They don't have that out there. You literally
Mhm.
have to buy a can of collard greens and go from there.
Mhm.
So I was like, let me go back to my freaking side into the
Yeah.
South. Return to I ran back to the South. I love
Yeah.
the South. I love Vegas. Great job. Great department. Ran back to the South. And
Back
even the people in Vegas made fun of me for being so Southern. They're like, oh, you so Southern. And at first I thought that that was an insult, and it probably was.
Mm.
But I took it as, you know what? I'm proud of that.
This is who I am.
This is
This
who I
is
am.
who I am. Wow.
Mhm, mhm.
What coming to the end, what do you want readers to take away from this book? When they put this book down, when they read the last page, the last word,
Yeah.
what do you want them to take away
Mm.
from Snapping Beans?
I want anybody, and I put this in here too. While this is the voices of Southern Black queer women and gender nonconforming persons, I want everybody to see themselves in this text in some capacities. I want them to see their love for the South and also the accountability of the South. I want for the cishet Black women to see how sexism and patriarchy also hinders their lives in the South, but also what the community of Black women, Southern Black women, the power that it can be, and the beauty that it can be.
Mm,
I want people to learn about for my Black men, whether gay or straight. I want us to see how gender politics exist in the South, and how
mm,
that also infects y'all, right? How
mm,
that impacts y'all's lives. So I hope it builds allyship in that way.
mm, mm,
I also hope that it brings people a level of empathy for the queer experience.
yeah.
I hope it not only empathy, but also the complexity of the Black queer
Mm,
experience. I want people to see that Blackness is not a monolith, that
yeah.
queerness is not a monolith, that these experiences, while I create this collective narrative, it's not really collective. Because, like I said, like you said, I'm infusing so many voices. And while there are certain thematical things that we deal with them differently. And
Mm,
so I want people to see the diversity in Blackness, the diversity of Southern Blackness. And I want folks to know that they are all included in this text in some capacity.
yeah. Yeah.
Mhm.
Listen, I'm full. I have eaten my beans.
You made your beans and you
I
had the
have
green
eaten
beans
the
with
the
the
meat
cornbread.
that has been used in the preserving of the beans.
Yes.
Do you have any last words for any of our listeners? Any last words or comments to put in their takeout box?
So I really want another reason why I wrote the text is because I wanted to put a microphone on in a community that otherwise wouldn't be heard.
Mm,
And I want us to be clear that this notion of the Black queer lesbian South has always existed in some capacity. You might have not called it that. You might have said someone was funny. You might have just looked at them and
mhm,
knew that they just didn't conform to
mhm,
normal things. But the Black queer lesbian South has always existed. So the only thing I did with this text is just shed light on it and to give these individuals a microphone. So I
yeah,
definitely want to make it clear that this is not just my story, but it's the story of 39 women and persons who have a vantage point of the South and they shared it with me. And that um, this South has always existed and it continues to exist and continue to thrive.
mm. Dr. Canty, thank you so much for
Thank you,
your
Dr. Grant, for having me.
listen. Thank you for being here. Thank you for the sacrifice, right? Because I know that writing this book took years and years and years of work, travel, money, resources, time. Your hair is beautiful, but I'm pretty sure it might be some grays up under there
Oh, listen,
because
that's why it's coming.
right.
Some great start to pop up, and I said, wait a minute, wait a
Right. But
minute.
I know that you put a lot of time, you put a lot of sweat equity, and just know that it does not go unrewarded. It does not go unnoticed.
Thank you.
for all of us, for Black queer people, for allies, for people outside of the Black community who can read this book and who can see the importance and the stories and can apply this to their group, to their race, to their gender, to their ideas, to their concepts, and begin to form a much more egalitarian, a much more communitarian society, which is what we all want to live in. So thank you so much for your contribution. Thank you so much for your scholarship,
Thank
for
you.
your intelligence, and for your love for our people and for people as a whole. So thank you.
Yeah, that's what I wrote it. I wrote it as a love story to our people, and I
Yeah.
wanted it to be that. Yeah. I mean, and it might be a situation where this book gets banned because it's a leftist agenda, and then,
You know what? It might be down here in Florida. You know what I mean?
it's
It
one of those
might.
books that won't be sold in certain stores,
Right.
you
But we
know.
we gonna keep fighting. We gonna
Right. What that means is I did my job.
that means you did your job. Thank you so much, and we appreciate you.
Thank you. Thank you for having me, and thank you for inviting me to have this conversation. I hope that your students and the people get what they need from this. And yeah, they can reach out to me at
Yes, please. Yes, if you want to leave any
Yes.
email or anything that you want to
Mhm.
share, so anybody could reach out to you.
Yeah, underscore Canty can underscore on Instagram. I
Mm,
am on Twitter or X, whatever they call it now, but
yeah,
barely, but it's Dr. J Canty.
mm,
Um, you can also just email me at jcanty@cau.edu.
yes, yes. Thank you so much. And that is the end of our conversation.
Yay, thank you.
Peace.